In the year 2019, the American debt stood at $69 trillion. 4 years later, this amount rose to $92 trillion, an increase of 30% in a short span of just 4 years. Now, earlier this year, US Treasury offered bonds of 3-year, 10-year, and 30 years maturity. The issue gets oversubscribed by 2.5 times. What was the reason behind such a behavior of investors wherein they are ready to advance more money to an already over-leveraged economy? In this episode, we shall try to explore the logic behind such a phenomenon and in the process, make a value addition to our knowledge as well. Firstly, we must understand that when we talk about the debt of an economy, we are not talking just about the government debt alone. Government debt is just one of the components of the debt of an economy. There are always multiple components of the total debt, which are government debt, household debt, non-financial corporate sector debt, and financial corporate sector debt. Now, let's go back to the incident that we talked about in the beginning, wherein the investors subscribed 2.5 times of what was offered by the treasury. See, for one thing, it's only the government borrowing that's up. The other components have significantly deleveraged. The biggest component of the American debt today is government debt itself. Of the total US debt of $92 trillion, $34.6 trillion is government debt alone. Although we can keep on saying that US debt has gone up significantly and it has leveraged on a very higher scale, but we must always keep in mind that seeing US debt in an absolute manner is not exactly the correct way of seeing it. As the economists point out, a correct way to think and analyze the debt would be to measure it relative to another variable, which also grows over time, and that would be the GDP. As the debt has risen, so has the GDP of USA. Nominal GDP in 1980 was $3 trillion. 2023, it is $28 trillion. Now a question should arise in our mind as to why only GDP can be used as the variable related to which the debt can be measured. Because there are also many other variables that have also increased over the period of time. But why only GDP? To answer this, we shall have to make a detour. If you have paid attention, then you must have noticed that I have used the term leverage many a time. So what exactly do I mean when I say that an economy is highly levered or less levered? See, all of us have a certain income, certain disposable income. What part of that disposable income do we use in order to pay off our debt obligations? This is what determines whether we are over-levered or under-levered. By that I mean to say, if the part of the income that you are using to pay off your debt obligation is on a higher side, then you will be considered to be more levered. And if that portion is on the lower side, then you will be considered less levered. Now when we notice the GDP being used as a measure relative to which we analyze debt, we must understand one thing, that GDP is nothing but revenue of an economy. And by comparing debt with the GDP, we are exactly measuring the leverage of our economy. So that is what the concept of leverage is, and why we use GDP only as a measure relative to which the debt of the economy shall be measured. Now let's move in our discussion further towards the household debt. The debt of the US household sector currently stands at nearly $20 trillion. This is about $5.3 trillion above the level of Q3 2008, when excessive household debt led to the global financial crisis. So, can we say that the household sector is headed for the same debt incurred debacle that befell it 15 years ago? Although the total household debt has risen more than $5 trillion since 2008. But the aggregate disposable income has also gone up by $9 trillion over the same period. The household debt to income ratio, referred to as the leverage, has receded by about 38 percentage points since its peak in 2007. However, interest rates are significantly higher than they were a few years ago. The higher interest rate can easily crimp the ability of households to service their higher stock of debt. Consequently, the debt servicing difficulties could weaken the consumer spending and by extension the macro US economy itself. Let's pull out some stats here. Of the total household debt, 70% is the mortgage debt. Since 2013, value of mortgage debt has risen by more than $4 trillion. Many of you may be shocked to hear this. After all, it was excessive mortgage debt and default in it that led to the global financial crisis. However, there are various things that should be put to perspective before we go on to form our own judgment. The underwriting standards for the mortgages today are considerably tighter than they were during the household bubble. Of the $11.8 trillion worth of mortgages that have originated since the onset of pandemic, nearly 70% of them have been made to the homeowners with FICO scores of 760 and above, which is considered to be very good. Only 5.6% has been to the individual with FICO scores less than prime, that is, a score of less than 660. This percentage was 25% at the height of the housing bubble. So you can see 5.6% is very much lower than 25%. Now let's see where the leverage is today. Ratio of mortgage debt to disposable income was 64% in 2023. The same thing was 100% in the year 2007, which means that what a person was earning, he was utilizing it entirely towards paying off his mortgage. Not only this, the households with mortgage debt are showing less stress at present than they were before the housing bubble burst. According to the data from Mortgage Bankers Association, only 3.6% of the mortgages are delinquent today, versus 5% in late 2006 when house prices were at its peak. Now let's move further into our discussion and discuss the next component of household debt, which is the student loan. Student loan comprises of 9% of total household debt, and it currently stands at $1.6 trillion. There are 43 million individuals with student loan balances. However, more than half of them have less than $20,000 worth of student loan. Only 1% of the student loans were delinquent in Q4 of 2023. However, this might have been largely due to the payment moratorium which was imposed by the government during the pandemic. As the borrowers start to make the payment again, the delinquencies will undoubtedly increase. However, it is expected that the effect on overall consumer spending should not be large. It is estimated that the resumption of student loan payments could reduce the aggregate consumer spending by only 0.40 to 0.60% on an annual basis. Now let's move further to our next component of the household debt itself, and that is the auto loans and the credit card debt. See, the current level of auto loans is $1.6 trillion. The delinquency rate in 2022 was 5%, which was the lowest rate in at least 20 years. The delinquency rate today is 7.7%, which is the highest rate since 2010. Now these delinquencies are likely to further increase because the car purchases that were financed in 2023 were made at the highest rates of interest since more than a decade. That said, credit quality today is much better than it was a few years ago. According to a data from Experian, 69% of auto loans at present have been made to the individuals with good credit score. This was 63% in 2019. So there is an improvement in that. Now coming to credit card debt. See, credit card accounts for more than 6% of the total household debt. Currently, it stands at $1.1 trillion. Delinquencies on credit card debt was 4% in early 2022. It has risen to 8.5% in the quarter 4 of 2023. The interest rates on credit card is also very high. In early 2022, it was 16%. Currently, it is 22%. These figures don't even include a very popular concept nowadays, which is buy now, pay later, wherein you purchase the goods now and make the payment for it later. Now, this is also a kind of debt, but this is not included in these statistics. So to conclude, we can say that although every major category of the household debt has increased in the recent year, so too has the household income. It is up 85% over the same period. Let's move on to the last part of our discussion, and that is the non-financial corporate sector debt. Debt in the NFC sector has risen 10 times over the past 40 years to its current level of $14 trillion. Overall, the debt of the NFC sector includes debt securities and loan. 40 years ago, the composition of debt was spread evenly between these two. But lately, the issuance in the corporate bond markets has been heavy. The debt security obligations of the NFC sector stands at $8 trillion, which is 60% of the total outstanding debt of NFC. When measured as a percentage of GDP, the NFC sector's debt to GDP ratio has gone from 30% in early 1980s to 50% today, making it as highly levered as ever. Not only has the leverage gone up, interest rates are also much higher. Most businesses borrow from the banks at some spread over a short-term benchmark rate, such as the SOFR. SOFR, by the way, stands for Secured Overnight Funding Rate, which is a rate that is determined by the banks and on a very short-term basis. Due to Fed's tightening cycle, these benchmark lending rates have risen more than 500 basis points since March 2022. Furthermore, the yields on the corporate bond are also higher today than they were a few years ago. What is going to be the effect of all this? So, the effect is going to be felt on the financing aspect of the businesses. The businesses won't be able to finance their funding needs via the long-term funds at a lower rate of interest. That is going to become a problem for them. As a result of that, the businesses will have to then resort to short-term financing more, and the proportion of short-term financing in their fund is going to see an increase. So that is what is going to happen, and it's not a good thing for the overall economy. Well, that was all for today's episode. Thank you for listening. Have a great time ahead, and do tune in for the next episode, which I will be posting very soon. Thank you. Bye bye.